On a freezing night in February 1842, the wind cut through the Georgia fields like sharp knives. The Whitmore Plantation stood silent, its great white house glowing faintly against the dark sky. Snow fell heavy, covering the land in silence, but that silence was about to be broken. 17-year-old Clara Johnson stumbled barefoot through the snow, her thin dress clinging to her shivering body. Two strong men dragged her forward, their lanterns swaying in the storm. Behind them walked Edward Whitmore, the master of the plantation, a cruel man whose voice was as cold as the wind itself. He was smiling. Edward had chosen tonight to teach Clara a final lesson. In his drunken rage, he told the others that she was too bold, too proud, too ungrateful. His plan was simple and merciless. Lock her inside the underground grain cellar, a place colder than death itself, and leave her there until morning. By then, she would either be broken or dead. The cellar was dug deep into the frozen earth, with stone walls that trapped the cold and air so thin it burned the lungs. No one could survive a whole night inside, and Edward Whitmore knew that. Clara stumbled as they pushed her to the cellar door. Her lips were blue, her breath coming out in sharp clouds of white. She said nothing, but her dark eyes were fixed on the wooden door in front of her, a door she knew better than anyone. For months she had been forced to work in that cellar, moving sacks of grain in the biting cold. She had studied its locks, its hinges, its hidden cracks. She knew its secrets. And tonight, she was ready. The heavy door creaked open, releasing a smell of damp earth and spoiled corn. The storm howled louder, as if warning the Whitmores of what was coming. Edward pushed Clara forward, but she did not resist. Instead, she turned her head slightly and whispered, almost calmly, "Are you sure the cold will not take you before it takes me, master?" Edward laughed, a cruel, careless laugh. His wife Margaret smirked. The Whitmore children giggled, their eyes shining with cruel excitement. None of them understood that Clara's words were not fear. They were a warning. What happened next would turn the Whitmore name into a curse. Before I tell you how Clara changed her fate that night, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. These forgotten stories of history deserve to be remembered, and your support helps us bring more of them to light. Now, let's return to the storm. As Edward reached the door to slam it shut, Clara moved with lightning speed. She twisted, slipped out his grip, and with one sudden motion, shoved the heavy door closed. The iron lock snapped into place with a sound like thunder. Inside, the Whitmore screamed. Outside, Clara stood in the storm, free for the first time. But this was only the beginning. The Whitmore Plantation stretched for miles across the frozen land, a place that looked rich and powerful from the outside, but inside it was built on suffering. The main house stood tall with its white columns and shining windows, like a proud monument in the middle of the Georgia fields. But every brick, every stone, and every crop of cotton came from the pain of the people forced to work there. Edward Whitmore, the master, was known across the county. He had inherited the plantation from his father, along with more than 100 enslaved men, women, and children. People said he was a man of fine manners in public, but behind closed doors he was feared by everyone who served him. His temper was short, his punishments long, and his cruelty endless. Many whispered that even other slave owners thought Edward went too far. His wife, Margaret Whitmore, was no less dangerous. She had the face of a lady but the heart of ice. Her sharp tongue could cut as deeply as a whip. She never lifted her hand to strike, but her words crushed spirits and her schemes left scars. Some said she was the one who gave Edward many of his cruel ideas. Then there were the Whitmore children. At only 12 years old, young Thomas Whitmore had already learned to copy his father's violence. He loved inventing punishments for the enslaved, smiling when others cried. His little sisters, Annabelle and Grace, were 10, and though their hands were too small for the whip, their games were just as cruel. They would steal what little the servants had, lie about them to get them punished, and laugh at their pain as if it were a toy. Together, the Whitmores ruled their land with fear. To the outside world, they were a fine family. Inside the plantation, they were monsters in human shape, and trapped within their world of cruelty was Clara Johnson. She had been born there on a cold winter night 17 years earlier. Her mother had died bringing her into the world, and her father had been sold away before she was old enough to remember his face. Clara grew up in the slave quarters under the care of an old woman who became her only family. This woman secretly taught Clara to read using scraps of paper, a dangerous skill that could cost some fingers or even life if discovered. But Clara's mind was sharp and her memory was strong. She studied the Whitmores in silence. She watched their movements, listened to their words, and memorized every weakness. By the age of 15, Clara had been brought into the main house as a servant. From that moment, she saw the family's true face every day. Edward's drunken rages, Margaret's cruel whispers, and the children's evil laughter were burned into her memory. Every day reminded Clara that she was not seen as human, but as property. And every day her anger grew. She waited silently for her chance. Clara Johnson had never known kindness from the Whitmores. Her first breath had been taken in the cold air of the slave quarters, and her first cry was drowned out by the sound of a whip cracking in the fields. Her mother died giving her life, and her father was sold away before she could even remember his face. To the Whitmores, Clara was not a girl. She was simply another piece of property, a tool to be used until it broke. But Clara was not like the others. From childhood, she carried a fire inside her. While many were broken by the endless cruelty, Clara held her anger close, hiding it like a knife she would one day use. She was clever, quiet, and observant. She learned that silence was safety, but she also learned to listen, really listen. Every conversation she overheard, every document she glimpsed while cleaning the master study, every whispered story told by the older slaves. She kept it all in her memory. In the slave quarters, there was one woman who saw Clara's potential. An old cook named Sarah had raised countless children left motherless by the Whitmore's greed. Sarah was the one who taught Clara how to sew, how to cook, and how to survive. But more than that, Sarah gave Clara a gift more powerful than any whip or chain. Sarah taught her to read. At night, by the dim light of a dying fire, Sarah would take scraps of newspaper or pages torn from discarded books. She would whisper the letters, guiding Clara's small hands over the words. Every word was dangerous, every lesson a risk. If the Whitmores ever discovered it, both Clara and Sarah could be beaten, maimed, or worse. But Clara was hungry for knowledge. She devoured every word, every secret. That secret literacy became her greatest weapon. It taught her that the Whitmores were not gods. They were fragile, flawed, and foolish. It showed her how their world worked, their debts, their trade routes, their dealings with other planners. She began to see the cracks in their power. When Clara was 15, her life changed again. She was pulled from the fields and brought into the main house as a servant. To some, this seemed like a privilege, but for Clara, it was a nightmare. Now she was face to face with the Whitmores every single day. She carried their food, washed their clothes, and stood silently while they spoke of her people as if they were cattle. She saw Edward's drunken violence, Margaret's icy cruelty, and the children's twisted games. She saw the master's greed and the mistress's jealousy. She saw everything. And Clara remembered. Each day in the house, her hatred grew sharper. Each day, her patience grew stronger. She understood something most did not. Survival was not just about enduring pain. It was about waiting for the right moment to strike. And Clara Johnson was waiting. The winter of 1842 was like no other. The wind cut through the Whitmore Plantation like knives, and the ground stayed frozen for weeks. The river turned to ice, the trees stood bare, and every breath burned in the lungs. For the enslaved, this season was a death sentence. Thin clothes, no shoes, and endless work in the cold left many sick, coughing, and weak. For Clara Johnson, the punishment was even worse. Edward Whitmore had ordered her to work in the underground grain cellar. The cellar was dug deep into the earth, dark and damp, with stone walls that trapped the bitter cold. Inside, sacks of corn and wheat rotted in piles, filling the air with a sour smell of mold. Rats scurried in the shadows, their sharp teeth echoing in the silence. The deeper Clara went, the harder it was to breathe. The air was thin, damp, and heavy. Her job was to stack the grain, sweep the floor, and keep the supplies organized. But Edward didn't care about order. This was punishment. He wanted her to suffer. Every day, hours in the freezing dark. Every night, she returned with blue lips and numb fingers. The cellar became her prison. But slowly, it also became her classroom. Clara began to notice its secrets. The way the wooden door closed with a heavy slam. The iron lock that groaned but held strong. The small vents that let in just enough air to keep someone alive, but not for long. She learned the sound of the hinges, the weak spots in the wall, the exact way the latch slid into place. The Whitmores thought they were breaking her. Instead, they were teaching her. Clara used the moments of solitude to think, to plan. She began hiding little things in corners. A piece of cloth, a broken nail she had sharpened like a pin, a small pouch of dried food stolen from the kitchen. She built a secret cache, preparing for a chance she knew would come. At times, the cold almost broke her. Her skin cracked, her teeth chattered, her body begged to give up. But inside her chest, the fire of survival burned hotter. Each shiver reminded her that she was alive. Each breath in that frozen dark reminded her that she was not a slave in her own mind. Margaret Whitmore made sure the punishments were cruel. On the coldest days, she sent Clara down into the cellar without shoes, her feet turning purple against the stone floor. When Clara returned, shaking and near fainting, Margaret would smile and say, "The cold gives you color in your cheeks." But Clara did not break. The cellar that was meant to be her grave became the place where she sharpened her courage. And when the moment came, she knew exactly how to turn the Whitmores' own punishment into their tomb. The winter night pressed down like a heavy shroud over the Whitmore Plantation. The wind howled across the fields, rattling the windows of the grand white house. Inside, a quiet tension filled the hallways, a tension that only Clara Johnson seemed to notice. Everyone else, Edward, Margaret, and their children, were drunk with excitement at the thought of punishing her. But Clara's mind was calm, sharp, and dangerous. Edward Whitmore, stumbling slightly from drink, barked orders at the men holding Clara. His face was red, eyes burning with anger and cruelty. "Take her to the cellar. Tonight she learns her place," he shouted, voice echoing in the freezing air. He didn't notice how Clara's dark eyes glinted with something cold, something calculated. Margaret Whitmore followed, her lips pressed into a thin line. She carried herself with icy grace, but her hands twitched as if eager to see Clara suffer. Behind them, the children skipped and laughed, their joy twisted. Young Thomas, barely 12, held a whip, already imagining the pain he would inflict. Annabelle and Grace clutched small sticks, giggling at their own imagined cruelty. It was a family ritual of horror, a lesson in domination taught from generation to generation. Clara's thin dress clung to her trembling body, her bare feet pressing into the snow. Each step sent a shiver up her spine, but her face remained calm. She didn't speak, didn't beg. Inside, her mind worked faster than the wind outside. She remembered every detail of the cellar. The rough stone walls, the thin iron-bound door, the small vents that let just enough air in to keep someone alive for a little while. She remembered the latch, the hinges, the sound the lock made when it clicked shut. Every detail was part of her plan. Edward reached the cellar and shoved Clara forward, intending to lock her inside immediately. "In you go!" he roared, raising his hand as if to strike. The men holding her hesitated, sensing the tension. But Edward pushed harder. Clara stepped forward, then suddenly twisted. In one smooth motion, she slipped from their grasp, her small hands pushing against the door as she leaned into it. The Whitmores froze for a heartbeat. Edward lunged, trying to grab her, but Clara was quicker. She slammed the heavy wooden door shut behind her and forced the iron lock into place. The sound echoed through the cold night, like a clap of thunder. Inside the cellar, the Whitmores' screams erupted. Margaret sharp, cutting cries pierced the dark, while Edward bellowed in disbelief. The children's laughter turned to screams, panic replacing excitement. They had expected Clara to suffer. They had expected fear. What they got was something else entirely. Outside, Clara took a deep breath, letting the cold air fill her lungs. Her fingers were numb, her body shivering violently, but her heart raced with triumph. For years, she had endured cruelty, watched loved ones die, and felt the chains of slavery pressed down on her. Tonight, she had turned the tables. Tonight, she was no longer a victim. Her escape had been careful. Months of observation, whispered conversations, and stolen scraps of food had prepared her for this moment. She had learned the cellar's secrets, studied the Whitmore's habits, and hidden small tools and supplies. Each piece of knowledge had been a step toward this night, and now it had all come together. Inside, the Whitmores pounded on the door. Edward screamed threats, Margaret cursed, and the children cried for help. But the cellar was designed for one purpose: to trap. Cold stone walls, little ventilation, and a heavy door meant that those trapped inside would quickly realize that escape was impossible. And now, the cruel family was learning that lesson in full. Clara stayed outside for a moment, listening to the distant screams, feeling the snow crunch beneath her feet. She could hear the wind, the crackle of the frozen earth, the faint murmur of the river far below. Every sound reminded her of freedom. Every breath reminded her that she was alive and that for the first time, she had power over her fate. Then, without hesitation, she moved. Her mind was already planning the next step. Supplies were hidden under the loose boards of the barn. Clothes, money, and forged papers waited for her. A horse, restless but ready, waited to carry her through the frozen fields and into the night. She could already picture the road ahead. The dark woods, the silent farmhouses, and eventually the port city of Charleston, where a new life waited. But the Whitmore's cries haunted the air, a grim reminder of what had happened and what she had unleashed. For a moment, she allowed herself a shiver of fear, not for her own life, but for the consequences of her actions. History would remember this night differently depending on who survived to tell it. Yet, Clara knew she had no regrets. As the storm roared around her, she took one last look at the grand white house, a place that had been her prison, her classroom, and her tormentor. Tonight, it had become the site of her revenge. Tonight, the Whitmores were paying for years of cruelty, trapped in the cold and dark that they had once used to break her spirit. And as Clara disappeared into the night, leaving footprints in the snow that would soon vanish, the legend of the Cellar Witch of Savannah quietly began. The Whitmore Plantation lay buried in a blanket of snow, quiet but for the furious wind that tore across the fields. Inside the underground grain cellar, the Whitmores struggled, trapped, and panicked. The cold had already begun to bite. Edward's face was pale, lips blue from the damp, icy air. His eyes, once so full of authority, now darted in terror. Every stone wall around him became a reminder that his power had vanished. Margaret Whitmore shrieked, slapping the walls, pounding on the heavy wooden door. Her usual sharp tongue could not cut to the terror and the cold. Her children cried and whimpered beside her, realizing that their games of cruelty had backfired in the most unimaginable way. The cellar, which had been a place of punishment for Clara, had now become their prison, a prison that they could not escape. Above the frozen ground, Clara stood silently for a moment, her chest heaving from the cold and adrenaline. She felt every nerve alive with triumph. But this was not just survival, it was justice. Years of cruelty, lies, and suffering had culminated in this single, decisive moment. She knew the Whitmores had underestimated her, not once, but always. And now, the tables had turned. Clara's mind raced, retracing everything she had learned in that dark, damp cellar. The heavy door that had once loomed like a tomb now loomed like her ally. The iron lock, sturdy and unyielding, had snapped shut with finality that even she had barely believed possible. The small vents, which had once let her breathe thin air for hours, now mocked the Whitmores, allowing just enough air to sustain life temporarily, but not forever. Edward screamed again, pounding the walls with desperate fists. "Open this door! Open it now!" he shouted, but the cold had numbed his strength. Margaret wailed beside him, her screams echoing off the stone walls. The children's sobs were pitiful, innocent only in their ignorance. Clara remembered them all as they had tormented others, laughing while others suffered. Tonight, laughter had left their mouths. Only fear remained. Clara's eyes scanned the snow-covered fields. The storm had masked her movements, hiding her from any watchful eyes on the plantation. Her preparations had been meticulous. Hidden supplies, carefully chosen tools, a small horse ready for the night, and forged papers. All of it lay waiting for her just beyond the barn. Every small detail she had anticipated, planned, and executed perfectly. She had turned months of observation and patience into an unstoppable force. Yet, she didn't rush. Clara knew that part of her power lay in restraint. She let the cold wind whip her hair across her face, let the snow sting her skin. She listened to the screams below, savoring the sound as strange and terrible as it felt. This was the moment when fear finally became real for the Whitmores. They had never known what fear felt like. They had never imagined a world in which they were powerless. The cellar's thick stone walls muffled her hearing, but Clara had spent long hours memorizing the sounds of the place. Every echo, every groan, every creak of the floorboards had been etched into her memory. Now, those sounds worked for her, not against her. She knew exactly how long the Whitmores could survive in the cold, damp darkness before the cellar began to sap their strength and their hope. And she knew she had all the time she needed. A sudden cry of despair pierced the storm. Edward had tried to pry the door open, but the iron lock held firm. Margaret's voice rang out, a mixture of rage and panic. The children's whimpers grew louder as cold began to bite through their thin winter clothes. Clara felt a strange chill in her chest. Not from the storm, but from a realization that her careful planning had worked flawlessly. The family who had brought so much pain to others now faced that same suffering. Clara moved toward the barn, each step measured, careful, and silent. Her boots sank slightly into the snow, leaving faint tracks behind her. She paused only once, glancing back at the distant silhouette of the house. For a moment, she felt the weight of her actions. Justice had a sharp edge, and she had wielded it perfectly. Still, there was no turning back. Freedom was calling, and she intended to answer. The storm whipped harder, snow blinding the horizon. Clara tightened the straps of the small bundles she carried. Clothing, money, and forged papers that would allow her to step into a new life. She approached the horse, untied it carefully, and whispered, almost to herself, "Let's go." The animal whinnied softly, as if sensing the significance of the night, and she swung onto its back. Below, the Whitmore's cries had begun to fade, not because they had found a way out, but because the cold and panic were claiming them. The cellar had become a tomb of justice, a reversal of all the cruelty it had once contained. And while Clara rode to the storm, each mile carried her further from the chains of her past and closer to a future built on her own terms. The legend of Clara Johnson, the girl who had been enslaved but became a force no one could contain, was only beginning. And tonight, in the icy darkness of Savannah, the cellar which had proven that even the smallest, quietest person could hold power beyond imagination. By dawn, the first light of morning painted the horizon in pale shades of gray. Clara paused briefly, looking back toward the Whitmore Plantation. Smoke rose faintly from chimneys. The wind carried the distant sound of chaos, but she did not hesitate. Her journey was not over. The path to freedom was long, but she had already conquered the first, most dangerous step. In that moment, as snowflakes melted on her eyelashes and the horse's breath steamed in the cold morning air, Clara Johnson, the girl who had been a slave, became Mary Ellis, the free woman. She rode into the unknown with nothing but courage, preparation, and a heart full of determination, leaving behind a legend that would echo through Savannah for years to come. And thus, the tale of the cellar which continued, whisper in the winds, carried across fields, and remembered by those who had once feared her power. Freedom had been claimed, but her story was only beginning. The morning after the storm was eerily silent. The Whitmore Plantation lay under a thick blanket of snow, sparkling under the pale February sun. But inside the grand white house, silence was broken only by the faint, frozen breath of the wind and the horrific realization that something was terribly wrong. The Whitmore family, the feared Edward, the cold Margaret, and their cruel children, were gone. Slaves who had endured decades of cruelty awoke cautiously. They whispered among themselves, eyes wide with fear and curiosity. "Where were the Whitmores?" one woman asked, her voice trembling. Others shook their heads, unsure if this was a trick, a nightmare, or something far worse. No one dared approach the main house at first. The stories of the cellar, of the cold and darkness within, had always been enough to keep even the bravest away. It was only when a young man, braver than the rest, crept toward the cellar that the truth began to emerge. The heavy wooden door, usually locked for punishment, was still shut tight. But the sound that came from within were not those of a human being trapped. They were screams of panic, terror, and despair. The smell of damp cold, combined with the faint stench of spoiled grain, hit him as he approached. He could barely comprehend the scene. Inside, the Whitmores were trapped, their cries echoing off the stone walls. Cold had begun to seep into their bones. The children whimpered. Edward cursed, and Margaret's sharp, commanding voice had turned into a panicked plea for mercy. No one had ever imagined the cellar could become anything other than a place to punish the enslaved, but now it had reversed roles entirely. The masters, monsters in their own right, were powerless, small, and afraid. By mid-morning, word spread quickly across Savannah. Neighbors, curious and cautious, arrived to witness what had happened. The whispers grew into shouts, and shouts into rumors that would last for years. "The Whitmores have vanished," people said. Their screams were heard through the storm. And some, fearful and uneasy, began to speak of the girl who had disappeared the same night. The girl who had survived the storm and somehow vanished from the plantation. Clara Johnson's legend began that very morning. No one had seen her leave, no one had heard her speak. But everyone knew the outcome. The Whitmore's screams, trapped in the cellar, became the first proof of her power. People whispered her name cautiously, some in fear, some in awe. The Cellar Witch of Savannah, they called her, and with every telling the story grew, each retelling adding a layer of fear and mystery. The enslaved workers who had once suffered under the Whitmores dared to move more freely. They whispered stories of the girl who had turned the master's own cruelty against them, and a cautious hope began to spread. Clara, or the figure who would become Mary Ellis, was no longer just a story. She was a symbol that even the most powerful could be undone by cunning, courage, and patience. Meanwhile, the city of Savannah buzzed with curiosity. Traders, travelers, and the wealthy elite discussed the event in hushed tones. What had happened to the Whitmores? Who had orchestrated it? How could a young girl escape the clutches of such a powerful family and leave them to die in their own cellar? Speculation ran wild, but no answers came. Clara Johnson had vanished completely from the public eye, leaving only whispers, rumors, and a growing legend in her wake. Locals began to add layers to the story. Some said that on the coldest nights, you could still hear screams coming from the abandoned plantation. Others swore that a shadowy figure moved across the fields, riding through the snow like a phantom. Children dared each other to venture near the plantation, only to run back screaming tales of a girl with eyes like fire, a woman who could command the storm. For Clara, now Mary Ellis, the legend was both shield and burden. She had survived, escaped, and begun a new life far from Savannah, but she knew the story of the cellar which would never die. Every whisper carried a warning. Cruelty, injustice, and cruelty unchecked would always find a reckoning. Her freedom had cost her stealth, her silence, and the careful planning of every moment, but it had ensured that the Whitmores and the memory of their tyranny would never be forgotten. By the time night fell over the plantation again, the legend of the cellar which had taken root in Savannah, it was a story told quietly, in shadows, in hushed voices, passed from one generation to another. It became a tale not just of revenge, but of cunning, courage, and survival. And while Clara herself was gone, riding toward a new life and a new identity, the world she left behind had been forever changed. The legend of the cellar which was born, not in the pages of history books, but in the snow, the cold, and the terrified screams of family who had underestimated the quiet strength of a young girl. And for those who dare to remember, it became a warning. No cruelty goes unpunished, and some spirits, once awakened, cannot be forgotten. Clara Johnson had vanished from Savannah, leaving behind the snow, the storm, and the shattered Whitmore Plantation. But she had not vanished into nothing. She had transformed herself into Mary Ellis, a new identity carefully forged with stolen papers, hidden money, and a determination as cold and sharp as the February wind that had carried her to freedom. The road north was long, dangerous, and full of unknowns, yet Clara pressed on, each mile a step away from slavery and toward a life she could finally call her own. The journey was grueling. Snow-covered fields gave way to forests dark and silent. Clara traveled mostly at night, riding her small, restless horse through narrow paths she had memorized from her careful planning. She avoided towns and plantations where bounty hunters might recognize a runaway slave. Every shadow became a potential threat, every sound a warning. Yet, with every obstacle, her courage grew. She was no longer the terrified girl who had once shivered in the grain cellar. She was a survivor, a strategist, and now a fugitive with purpose. Her supplies were limited but sufficient. Hidden in her satchel were scraps of dried food, cloth, and a small sum of money she had taken from the Whitmore barn. The forged papers she carried were her shield, a document declaring her as Mary Ellis, free and unknown to those who sought to enslave her. Each document, each item, had been chosen with care. Clara understood that one mistake could cost her freedom or her life. By the time she reached Charleston, the port city on the coast of South Carolina, she had learned to move silently, speak cautiously, and trust very few. The city was bustling, full of strangers and opportunity. The busy streets, the cries of merchants, and the rolling of carts over cobblestones provided cover for a girl seeking to vanish among the crowd. Clara's heart raced as she approached the docks, knowing that the city could either be her sanctuary or a trap. Finding work was difficult. Mary Ellis could not reveal her past, could not speak of the horrors she had endured, for fear that someone might recognize her or that her identity could be traced back to the Whitmore Plantation. She took odd jobs at first, cleaning houses, sewing garments, running errands for small businesses. Every stitch she sewed, every meal she prepared, was a step toward rebuilding herself. Each day, she grew stronger, more confident, more certain that freedom was not just a word. It was a life she was crafting with her own hands. But the past never truly left her. At night, Clara often lay awake in the tiny room she rented, the sounds of Charleston drifting into the cracks of the walls. She remembered the screams in the cellar, the icy air, the twisted smiles of the Whitmores. Those memories were not just pain, they were lessons. They had taught her caution, patience, and how to survive when every moment was a test. And while she no longer feared the Whitmores themselves, she knew that the shadow of her past would follow her forever. As months passed, Clara built a small, quiet life. She became known as Mary Ellis, a seamstress with skill and care. Customers admired her work. Friends trusted her discretion, and neighbors began to respect the quiet, intelligent woman who seemed to carry a calm strength. Her new identity shielded her, allowed her to live without fear of capture, and slowly, she began to allow herself small joys she had never known as a slave: warmth, safety, and a sense of belonging. Yet, Clara never forgot the lessons she had learned in the grain cellar. Freedom was precious, and it required vigilance. She continued to move carefully, avoided unnecessary attention, and never lingered too long in one place. Her courage, sharpened by years of suffering, guided her choices. And though she was far from Savannah, her heart remained tied to the memory of the plantation, the people she had left behind, and the revenge she had executed with such precision. The legend of Clara Johnson, the Cellar Witch, continued to grow in Savannah, whispered in fear and awe. But Mary Ellis, the woman she had become, lived quietly, carefully, and freely. She built a new life from the ashes of her past, a life she had fought for with every ounce of courage she possessed. In her heart, she carried both the scars and the victories of her former life, a reminder that survival and freedom often came at a high cost. And so, Clara Johnson, once a slave, then a fugitive, now Mary Ellis, lived in the North, far from plantation and the family who had once ruled over her. She was free, yet haunted by memory, safe, yet aware of the fragile line between life and death. And in that quiet existence, she discovered the true power of resilience, intelligence, and courage, a power that had begun in a dark, icy cellar and would echo forever in the legends of Savannah. Years passed, and Savannah slowly healed from the storm and the horrors of that February night in 1842. But some wounds never truly closed. The Whitmore Plantation stood silent and abandoned, its grand white columns now weathered and cracked, a ghostly reminder of the family that had once ruled with fear. The story of that night, the night the Whitmores vanished in their own cellar, remained etched into the memory of the city, whispered in hushed tones by those who had survived under their tyranny. Clara Johnson, now living as Mary Ellis in the North, had carved out a life far from Savannah. She was a seamstress, quiet and careful, blending into the bustling streets of her new home. She lived simply, but freely, a life built on courage, patience, and intelligence. And though she had escaped the chains of slavery, the memories of her past never left her. Each stitch she sewed, each garment she completed, carried a piece of her history, a reminder of the suffering she had endured and the revenge she had executed with meticulous precision. In Savannah, the legend grew. People spoke of the Cellar Witch in whispers, sometimes in fear, sometimes in awe. Stories were passed from neighbor to neighbor, from parent to child. They told of a girl who had endured unimaginable cruelty and had struck back with cunning and courage. They spoke of the Whitmore screams echoing to the frozen walls of the grain cellar, and of a girl who had vanished into the storm, never to be seen again. Over time, the line between history and legend blurred. Clara Johnson became a symbol, a force that could not be silenced, a story that could not be erased. Historians would later debate the events of that night. Some claimed it was murder. Others claimed it was survival and clever planning. Few could verify the details, for Clara Johnson had disappeared without a trace. But one thing was certain. Her actions had changed the narrative of Savannah forever. The Whitmore family, once feared and untouchable, became a cautionary tale. Their cruelty had been their downfall, and their name became synonymous with horror and loss. Clara herself understood the lesson of her journey better than anyone. She had learned that survival alone was not enough. One had to act with strategy, courage, and intelligence. She had learned that the oppressed could rise, that even those who seemed powerless could alter their destiny. And she had learned that freedom, once claimed, must be guarded fiercely, for the world was not always forgiving. Every decision she made from that night onward reflected this wisdom. Even as she built her quiet life, Clara never forgot those who had suffered alongside her. She carried their memories silently, honoring them through her resilience. Each day, she lived in a way that celebrated the freedom that had all been denied, a freedom she had won not just for herself, but symbolically for all who had endured the tyranny of the Whitmores. Her life became a testament to the strength of the human spirit, a reminder that courage and intelligence could triumph over cruelty. And yet, the legend remained alive in Savannah. Locals still whispered that on the coldest nights, if the wind was right, you could hear faint screams carried across the snow-covered fields. Some claimed to see a shadowy figure riding to the winter storm, a reminder that Clara Johnson, or the spirit she had become, was never truly gone. Children dared each other to approach the ruins of the Whitmore Plantation, and older generations warned them with hushed voices. Cruelty has consequences, and some spirits cannot be forgotten. Clara's story also left a deeper mark, a lesson in human nature. It revealed the dangers of unchecked cruelty, the fragility of power when wielded without justice, and the incredible resilience of those who endure suffering with patience and courage. It showed that even the smallest, quietest person could possess strength far beyond what others imagined. And above all, it proved that freedom, though hard-won and dangerous, was the most powerful force of all. As Mary Ellis, Clara continued her life quietly, her existence a blend of normalcy and remembrance. She never returned to Savannah, yet the legacy of her actions traveled far beyond the plantation. The cellar which became more than a story. It became a warning, a lesson, and a symbol of justice. Her revenge had been cruel, calculated, and precise, but it had also been a necessary assertion of power in a world that had tried to strip her of everything. And so, the Whitmore Plantation still stands in ruins today, a frozen monument to cruelty, revenge, and resilience. Visitors and locals alike speak of it with reverence and fear. Some claim that on the coldest nights, the wind carries the echoes of screams, the chilling reminder of what happened there. But most remember Clara Johnson, the girl who became Mary Ellis, the slave who escaped, the legend who reminded the world that even the oppressed can rise, and that justice, once served, leaves a mark that lasts forever. Clara Johnson's story is more than history. It's a lesson in courage, survival, and the fight for freedom. If her journey gave you chills, inspired you, or made you see the strength of the human spirit, make sure to hit that like button. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss another story of courage that history tried to forget. Share this video with someone who needs to witness the power of resilience, because some legends deserve to be remembered forever.